My name is Brian and this happened to me about 5 years ago. My best friend, Kyle, and I have known each other since childhood. We were both nearing 30 when this story occurred. Kyle and I had always been city boys, with little experience in natural environments, but we decided it was time to change that. So, for our annual vacation, we chose to rent a cabin through Airbnb. The cabin wasn't exactly a wilderness retreat, it had electricity, indoor plumbing, and even Wi-Fi. The signal wasn't the best, but it was something. However, the location was quite secluded, with the nearest neighbor several miles away. We had taken a week off from work, but we could only stay in the cabin for 4 nights. The drive there took about 5 hours from our city. When we spotted the cabin, it was as promising as we had hoped. It wasn't quite what you'd expect from a cabin, it had vinyl siding instead of wooden logs. But that was irrelevant to us, what really mattered was the location, and this place was perfect. There was an amazing view from the balcony, and the living room window overlooked a small lake in the distance. I parked the car, and we got out. Our host had provided us with a code for the door, so I checked it on my phone and we made our way down the path to the entrance. When we reached the front door, something caught our attention. The electronic lock was somewhat broken. It still worked, but it was loose on the door. I entered the code, and it opened, but I was pretty sure it could have been easily removed if someone tried. It seemed a bit insecure, but there was another lock inside, so we decided it was okay. The interior was simple, with 1 bedroom and a loft. Kyle chose the bedroom, and I took the loft, as he's afraid of heights. We settled in for the night and woke up early the next morning to explore. The first trail was short, and we finished before noon. After lunch, Kyle found another trail that was a bit farther by car, so we headed there. It was a longer hike, and it took us almost the whole day to complete. By nightfall, we stopped at a restaurant for dinner, as we were too exhausted to cook back at the cabin. When we returned, it was quite late, around 1 a.m., and the road was dark. I thought I saw a silhouette darting quickly across the front of the car, but I wasn't sure if it was an animal or a person. We were close to the cabin, so if it was a person, they would certainly be trespassing. I didn't mention anything to Kyle, as I wasn't sure if it was relevant. Inside the cabin, we talked for a while, and then went to bed. I climbed up to the loft, and Kyle went to the bedroom. The next thing I remember is being woken up by Kyle's scream. I rushed downstairs and went to his room, not knowing what to expect. Upon entering, I turned on the light and saw a man jumping out the window. I only caught a glimpse of his back and maybe a leg. He was almost out when I got there. Kyle was standing there, trembling, completely pale. He said he woke up to the man rummaging through his things. When Kyle yelled, the man ran, fumbled with the window lock, opened it, and jumped out. We were deeply shaken. It took us about 10 or 15 minutes to calm down. Then, some pieces of the puzzle started to fit together. We figured the man had been hiding in the cabin without anyone knowing. Kyle then approached the closet and opened it. The strange backpack was gone. We were certain it belonged to the intruder, or maybe he stole it. Although it was dirty and torn, it looked like his. We stayed awake for the rest of the night with the lights on, discussing what to do. We checked all the windows and doors to make sure they were secure, but we were still scared. As soon as the sun rose, we packed our things and left. We had planned to stay longer, but neither of us wanted to spend another minute in that place. We locked the door as best as we could and drove away. On the way, Kyle called the host and explained everything: the broken lock, the backpack, and the man at night. The host was shocked and promised to come fix the lock immediately, as well as give us a full refund for the stay. I would have been satisfied with just the refund for the unused days because of the incident, so I didn't leave a negative review, as he seemed to be taking the situation seriously. We believe the man we saw was secretly living in the cabin when it wasn't being used. So when we stayed there, he must have decided to rob us. I didn't get a good look at the man, but Kyle had a better view of him and didn't see a gun, a knife, or any kind of weapon. That doesn't mean the man wasn't dangerous, we just don't know for sure. Every now and then, I would check Airbnb to see if the place was still available. At least for a few years after, it was still operating and had good reviews, many of which were after our stay. So, I guess the man must have been caught, or maybe he just moved on, or possibly the host increased security enough to scare him off. That's good, I suppose, but I won't risk staying at that place again. I would be too afraid. My name is David, and this happened to me about 5 years ago. My sister, Sarah, and I decided to spend a weekend at a rented cabin. It was an area we used to visit every summer when we were kids. Now adults, we wanted to go back there out of nostalgia. A family friend used to have a property nearby, but had to sell it years ago. The place we rented on Airbnb looked almost like a townhouse in the woods. There were 2 other units attached, and I think both were also available for rent, but we only saw ours on the platform. It was a cozy place, surrounded by trees, with no other cabins for a mile or 2 in any direction, besides our immediate neighbors. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The road was a long dirt path, almost too narrow for a car. As we were arriving, we saw a man walking along the side of the road. He was middle-aged and wore a blue baseball cap, with long hair sticking out from under the cap, and a red flannel shirt. We thought he might be one of our neighbors, but when we got to the cabin and met the other people, we found out he wasn't. The cabins were charming, with a small porch in the front and another at the back. There was a fireplace inside, with a small couch and 2 chairs facing it. We spent the evening cooking, playing board games, and enjoying each other's company. The first sign that our quiet weekend might be interrupted came on the first night. We were in the living room talking around the fireplace when we heard a knock on the door. We weren't expecting anyone, so it was a surprise. I went to see who it was, with Sarah following closely behind. On the porch was the man we had seen by the roadside. I opened the door, leaving the security latch closed. He quickly explained that he was looking for his lost dog and asked if we had seen it. We said no and offered to keep an eye out. He muttered something and disappeared into the growing darkness of the night. As an animal lover, I could understand, but it seemed strange. If my dog had been missing for hours, I would have knocked on doors much sooner. The man also didn't seem very concerned. I wasn't sure if he was pretending, but to me, it didn't make sense. The next day, we saw him again. He was walking past the front of our cabin, still without a dog. He didn't come to the door, and he didn't see us looking out the window. His presence was unsettling, but we tried to brush off our concerns, thinking maybe he was desperate to find his dog. That night, however, something else happened. There was another knock on our door, much later than the night before. I looked out the window and saw it was the same man. This time, I didn't open the door. I just said, "Can I help you?" He claimed his car had broken down and he needed to use our phone to call for help. His appearance was more disheveled than the day before, and there was an intensity in his eyes that made us nervous. I told him, through the closed door, that I would call for help, but when I went to get my phone, I found there was no signal. The signal had always been weak since we arrived, but at that moment, it was completely absent. I informed him that my phone wasn't working and suggested he check with one of the other neighbors. I closed the curtains and sat on the couch with Sarah. We whispered about the man as we sat there. We could see through the curtains that he was still on the porch. He started pacing back and forth, occasionally stopping to knock on the door or window, asking us to open up. Not in an aggressive way, but in a playful and really creepy way, like a clown from a horror movie. It was as if he was playing with us. Sarah and I stayed up all night keeping watch. We barricaded the door with furniture, whispered in hushed tones, and jumped at every sound. The man stayed on our porch for hours, pacing back and forth, eventually sitting on the steps as if he was waiting for us to change our minds. We watched it all through a crack in the curtains. When the first rays of light appeared, we were exhausted and determined to leave. We packed our things quietly and moved quickly. The man was still outside, now asleep on the porch. We managed to slip past him, get into the car, and drive away without waking him up. As soon as we left the cabin behind, the relief was palpable. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, where we called the police and reported what had happened. We also called our Airbnb host, who surprisingly seemed quite indifferent. We found out it wasn't the first time this had happened. The host seemed to think the man was harmless, but when we told him he literally slept on the porch, he was shocked. I hope he took action. That summer, after my second year in college, I decided to manage an Airbnb my parents had bought as an investment. I lived on the main floor of the house, a two-story property, while the upstairs had been converted into a two-bedroom apartment that I managed. It was a good arrangement. I took care of the property for my parents and, in return, lived there for a very low rent, sometimes even for free, depending on the Airbnb occupancy, although that was rare. The house had a single entrance used by both me and the guests. There was a shared hallway, where the laundry room was, a heavy door to my space, and a staircase leading to the rented unit upstairs, which also had its own locked door. The rental was going well. We usually had a steady flow of guests, mostly tourists. We lived in a quiet mountain town, crowded in winter because of the ski season, and in summer, it was also a good destination, although quieter. I met many interesting people, and for the most part, they were positive experiences. Over the years, a few things happened that I'd prefer not to repeat. I've seen it all. The place was trashed a few times, there was noise so loud the neighbors called the police, and someone even threw a chair out the window once. Fortunately, Airbnb often reimburses well for that kind of damage. But even after going through all that, one night still stands out to me. It was a Friday night, and I had just finished cleaning up after dinner when I heard noise coming from upstairs. It wasn't unusual since I had a guest staying. It was a solo traveler who seemed friendly when they checked in. I didn't think much of it and settled in the living room to watch TV. It was unusual to see just one person because our place was big enough for at least three, with 2 bedrooms and a sofa bed in the living room. There were motels in town that would be cheaper, so we usually got groups of at least 2 people. But it was the summer season, so our prices were a bit lower than in winter, still around $150 a night. As time went on, the noise upstairs grew. I could hear music and the sound of someone talking, though slurred. Since they were alone, I wasn't sure who they were talking to. Maybe they knew someone in town or were on the phone. It seemed like the guest had been drinking, maybe too much. I thought about going up and asking them to lower the volume, but I decided not to. I didn't want to be an overbearing host, and I figured they would eventually calm down. But around midnight, things took a turn for the worse. I was in bed, still awake, when I heard heavy footsteps coming down the Airbnb stairs. Then I heard loud banging on my door. I got up from bed and went to check. I knew it was my guest and hoped I could convince them to go to bed. "Who is it?" I called out. They were mumbling, barely coherent, but I could understand enough. They were demanding to be let in. Confused and alarmed, I informed them that this was my private residence and that they needed to go back upstairs, but they weren't listening. They kept shouting and banging on the door louder, their words jumbled and incoherent. Obviously, I didn't open the door, but I couldn't just go to bed either. I didn't know what they were capable of in that state. I grabbed my phone and called the police. I had called them a few times before, so I explained that it was a disruptive guest and asked them to send someone over. They told me officers were on their way and to stay on the line. The noise continued, and this time, I looked through the peephole. I saw the guy out there, with bloodshot eyes and shirtless. But the worst part was realizing that, tucked into his pants, there was a firearm. Guns are common where I live, so I usually don't get scared by them, but in that situation, it was absolutely terrifying. I backed away from the door, not knowing what he would do if he managed to get in. I was alone, and the thought of facing a drunk, angry, armed man was not appealing at all. I rushed back to my room and locked the door. It didn't even have a bolt. About 5 minutes later, the police arrived and took the guy away. Later, one of the officers came to talk to me. He explained that the guest was extremely drunk and was taken to the station for the night. The next day, the police called me, and I found out even more disturbing details. Turns out the guy had a criminal record and wasn't allowed to own a firearm. His gun was unregistered and likely bought on the black market. He had served time for armed robbery and home invasion before. That seemed to make sense. I guess that night was just an old habit for him. So, I almost got robbed by one of my guests. It was the worst thing that's happened to me so far. When I went up to the apartment to check for damage, surprisingly, it wasn't that bad. There were a few empty liquor bottles and some spilled drinks, but I'd seen much worse. The mess wasn't the issue, but the attempted break-in certainly wasn't something I appreciated. During the summer vacation after my second year in college, my friends and I decided to embark on an adventure. There were 3 of us, me, Lucy, and Ethan. Ethan and I were roommates, while Lucy lived elsewhere with other roommates. After spirited discussion about where to go, we settled on Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. We lived in Charlotte, so it wasn't a terribly long trip, but definitely a change of scenery. Ethan and I found an Airbnb that seemed perfect, a charming little bungalow in a quiet neighborhood, with a price that fit our limited student budget for a 3-night stay. There were only 2 bedrooms, so one of us would have to sleep on the sofa bed in the living room. With our bags packed, we set off excitedly. The journey was pleasant, with loud music and conversations about what we hoped for the trip. Since the car was mine, I ended up driving most of the way, so by the time we arrived, I was exhausted. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in vibrant colors. Ethan, who was the co-pilot, used his phone to guide us to the Airbnb. When we arrived, there was a man on the porch, something we didn't expect. Most hosts leave the key somewhere accessible and don't bother to meet guests in person, but this gentleman seemed to prefer direct contact. After parking, we were greeted by him. The owner's name was Henry, and from the first moment, something about him struck us as odd. He was a man in his 50s, with a restless air. He greeted us with a somewhat tense smile and quickly ushered us inside the house. Henry made a point of showing us every corner of the house, an attention to detail that left us somewhat uncomfortable. He explained how to operate the thermostat, took us down to the basement to show us the water heater, and even taught us how to change a fuse, details that seemed excessive for a short stay. Henry's prolonged presence made us anxious for him to leave so we could relax. After over an hour, we finally had the space to ourselves. We unpacked quickly and went out to explore the area and have dinner. Upon returning, we decided to spend the night in the living room, chatting and planning the next few days. Lucy and Ethan quickly chose the bedrooms, leaving me with the sofa bed. The bungalow was cozy and well-equipped, perfect for our small group. The next day went smoothly, enjoying the beach and local attractions, returning to the Airbnb only at dusk for a quiet evening. However, our tranquility was interrupted when, without warning, the power in the house was cut off. The sudden darkness caught us off guard, interrupting our casual conversation. We quickly resorted to our phones to illuminate the room and try to understand what had happened. A glance out the window confirmed that only our house was without electricity. The others in the neighborhood were shining normally. We then remembered Henry's detailed instructions and went to the basement to check the circuit breaker, but everything seemed fine, with no tripped breakers. Confused and unsure what to do, we returned to the living room. We debated whether we should bother Henry at that hour, but we decided to wait until the next day. Unexpectedly, around 11 p.m., we heard knocks on the door. Upon opening, we were met by Henry, who claimed to be passing by and noticed the lack of light. His presence and explanation seemed suspicious, especially because we hadn't notified anyone about the issue. The suggestion that he could have tampered with the power to have a reason to return seemed plausible and increased our unease. After a brief and awkward dialogue, Henry bid us goodbye, and we closed the door, more relieved with his departure. The situation left us uncomfortable and raised suspicions about Henry's true intentions. Despite considering various actions, including calling the police or simply leaving, we chose to give him the benefit of the doubt, thinking that maybe he was just an overly zealous host. However, the next morning revealed an even more disturbing development. Upon waking up, Lucy found a note from Henry next to her bed, saying that he had returned to fix the electricity. The invasion of our privacy, especially accessing Lucy's room without our knowledge, was the last straw. We immediately decided to leave the bungalow and end our stay at a hotel, seeking more security and privacy. Although I lived in a condo in the heart of a big city, I wasn't the owner, I rented the place. Luckily, my building was mainly occupied by Airbnb rentals, which meant a constant stream of different people coming and going. Weekends were particularly noisy, with the hallways and common areas crowded with vacationers from elsewhere, resulting in much more parties than anywhere else I had lived. I worked from 9 to 5, so I usually went to bed around 11 p.m. or midnight at the latest. It wasn't uncommon to be woken up or kept awake by shouting or other noise. I learned to live with it. It wasn't ideal, but moving was a hassle, and I had scored a good deal on my rent. This happened several years ago, on a summer Wednesday night. After a busy day at work, I worked in an office near my condo. All I wanted was a quiet evening. I made dinner, watched some TV, and then settled on the couch with a book. It was around 11 p.m. when the noise started. At first, it was just loud voices in the hallway, which wasn't uncommon, so I tried to ignore it and focus on my reading. But the voices got louder. There must have been at least 4 people shouting at each other, sounding like a fight was about to break out. It was hard to ignore, and my attention was diverted. Then, I heard a banging sound, which could have been someone pushed against the wall. Things escalated from there. Fights had occurred in the building before, but they usually ended quickly. Our building security usually managed to handle most issues, and I had never needed to call them. The building was equipped with cameras, so they usually were in the loop about everything that happened. However, this time, The argument escalated so quickly that I think the guards didn't have time to intervene. There were crashes and sounds of things being broken, like someone was being thrown around. I thought about calling security, but before I could decide, a loud sound cut through the noise. It had to be a gunshot. The sound echoed through the hallway, and a chilling silence followed. My hands were shaking, and my mind raced in panic. I had never been so close to real violence, let alone a shooting. For a few moments, I was frozen, not knowing what to do. I felt that sound deep in my chest. I had no idea how loud a gunshot could be. I even checked myself to make sure I hadn't been hit, it sounded so close. Then, I heard someone running down the hallway, their footsteps scraping against the cheap carpet lining the floor, followed by the sound of a door slamming. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, and I quickly explained what had happened. She told me to stay in my apartment, lock the door, and wait for the police to arrive. My door was already locked, so I just went to my bedroom and stayed there, pacing occasionally. Within minutes, I heard sirens approaching. There were sirens around all the time, but I was pretty sure these were for us. I heard the officers outside in the hallway, talking and moving around. They knocked on every door on my floor and eventually reached mine. I let them in and answered some questions. I told them everything I had heard, the argument, the loud bang that sounded like a gunshot, and the sound of someone running. I didn't know which door the person had gone into, but it was one of the ones next to mine. The officers took note of what I said and told me to stay inside my apartment. They needed to check the rest of the building. I locked my door after they left and went back to the living room. I was still quite shaken up. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but I really couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about the gunshot and how close it had been to my apartment. It was scary to think that something like that could happen right next to where I lived. The rest of that night was tense. I stayed up late, listening to the sounds in the building. I heard the police talking to other people and moving around. After a while, things started to calm down, but I still felt uneasy. The next morning, I found out more about what had happened. Someone had actually been shot. I learned that the shooting victim survived and was recovering. The person responsible was eventually apprehended and arrested. It turns out it was a dispute between two Airbnb guests that tragically escalated. In the days that followed, the police came back a few times, asking more questions, trying to piece together the events of that night. The shooting changed the atmosphere in the building. Once the news spread about what happened, the rental scene in the building dwindled. No one wanted to stay there anymore. The building management beefed up security, but that wasn't enough for me. I moved out the next month, having to break my lease. I figured rents would go back up once the news cycle passed, but that building wasn't a good place to live. I just couldn't stay there. Hey, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you liked it and want to see more similar stuff, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. Your help is super important for us to keep bringing content and means a lot to us. I also want to know what you guys thought of the video, so feel free to leave your comments below. What you think really helps us know what to bring new for you guys to watch. Until next time, stay safe out there, and remember, it's always a pleasure to be here with you.